Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for getting up early for us. You will be rewarded. You've got three of the most engaging and articulate speakers and authors in the UK. Just to introduce myself, until 2009, I was the editorial director of Francis Lincoln Children's Books, and I now publish my own eponymous list with Francis Lincoln. I'm also very proud to publish these three distinguished ladies, all prize-winning novelists of groundbreaking fiction, and all with a strong interest in and concern for the great traditional stories of the world. And that is what we're going to be talking about today. So to introduce directly on my right, Elizabeth Laird, Scottish author of many important novels, 5 times Carnegie shortlisted. Her novels raise issues of cultural identity and issues of huge global importance, including Crusade, A Little Piece of Ground, and her latest, The Prince Who Walked with Lions, all in Marilyn's wonderful bookshop. And then collections of folktales from Ethiopia, Iraq, Somalia, and most recently, the great Shahnameh from Iran, published by Francis Lincoln. Jamila Gavin in the middle, Whitbread Prize winner of Coram Boy, the Robber Baron's Daughter, the Surya Trilogy, and Alexander the Great, Man, Myth or Monster, and many younger novels as well. And then her Tales from India, and for Francis Lincoln, School for Princes, Stories from the Panchatantra. Finally, last but not least, Beverley Naidoo, author of groundbreaking contemporary classic fiction, Journey to Joburg, which I think has celebrated its 25th anniversary, and The Other Side of Truth. For Francis Lincoln, S is for South Africa, a really interesting non-fiction picture book, and also for us, The Great Tug of War, and Aesop's Fables, which she'll be talking about today. We're going to explore the different ways of coming to traditional story, and the authors are going to talk about the way they've been inspired and found the great stories of the world to tell in their books. And they're each going to talk in turn about their own experience. We're on quite a short time limit, so I'm keeping them to 15 minutes each. And we'll take it from there. It's going to be very exciting, starting with Liz Laird.
Good morning, everybody. And Janetta, you've got to shut me up. I've got my watch, but, you know, it's over to you. And it's such a pleasure to be with, three really good friends together, because we've all known each other forever, and we're really good mates. So great to be with you three friends doing this session. Okay, now, again, I want to congratulate you for turning up in what I consider to be the graveyard slot on a Sunday morning. Thank you for coming. And I want to start this whole morning about storytelling from the very beginning, which is thinking about the generations of storytellers going back hundreds, but actually thousands, and in fact tens of thousands of years, who kept stories in their heads, who couldn't read and write, but who passed their great stories down through generations. And I've been incredibly lucky to catch the tail of that wonderful animal of storytelling. Because about 10 years ago, I made a series of journeys to every region of Ethiopia, from the deserts in the northeast to the cool central highlands. Oh yes, there we go. The cool central highlands, the hot southwest, the lakes of the Rift Valley, and the remote borders of Kenya and Sudan to collect stories that were still being told by traditional storytellers. It was dangerous. There were bandits. There were lions in the grass and men with Kalashnikovs to keep us safe. It was exciting. I had the time of my life. The idea was to produce readers in simplified English so that Ethiopian schoolchildren, because the language of instruction, the medium of instruction is Ethiopia, and I worked as a teacher in Ethiopia back in the 1960s, I'm that old, and the idea was to produce readers in simplified English so that Ethiopian children could read their own stories while they were learning English and not have culturally inappropriate or strange subject matter. And the whole project was organised by the Ministry of Education in Addis Ababa and the local ministries of culture in each region and the British Council. And it was the British Council who sent me off on my journeys with a Land Rover and a translator from Amharic to English. And there's Amharic, the beautiful, beautiful script. Go on, you've got to admit. I mean, look, there's Ethiopian folktales in English, and underneath it in Amharic. Wonderful. Very ancient script. I had no idea what riches I would uncover. And as time went on, and I travelled so many thousands of miles, I began to feel like the brothers Grimm in the 19th century, who had travelled about Europe, catching hold of those precious stories from people who just oral storytellers before they disappeared. Because the sad truth is that as soon as people go to school and learn to read and write, and as soon as they have radios and televisions, they stop telling stories to each other. And within a generation, the stories are forgotten. And time and again, I'd arrive in a town and they'd say, oh, there was an old man who knew wonderful stories, but he's died. And I once sat with a storyteller and he tried to tell me a story, but he had actually started to suffer from senile dementia and he'd forgotten them. And it was so sad. So I felt, well, it was wonderful. Picture the scene. It's dark. I'm in a place called Gambela in the far southwest of Ethiopia. I'm sitting under a mango tree. The town generator has cut out and there's no light at all. And I'm waiting for a storyteller to come and tell me a story. I'm sitting on a bench under a tree. I don't hear him coming. He arrives. He's very tall. I can't see him. He sits down beside me. And in a deep, wonderful voice, he says, my story is about a cannibalistic ogre. And my flesh creeps. My flesh creeps. And another few months, a year later, I'm sitting with some ladies in a beautiful old house in the walled city of Harar. Wonderful house. And they've been praying. And they're fluttering satin garments all around me. And one of them starts to tell a story, and she sings, Minteri, and the others all cry, Mintasami. What do I hear something. What do you hear? And then the storyteller begins, once there was a girl, and she chants it. But after a while, she stops chanting and just tells it. I could describe dozens of different experiences like that. All 300 stories that I collected have now been published on this website, ethiopianfolktales.com, in English and in Amharic, so you can choose which language you want to read them in. They're exactly in the words of the translators. I haven't altered them at all. They're just as they were told me by translators, some of whom didn't speak very good English. And if you click on the audio link below, you can listen to the voices of the storytellers in their own language. The project was never completely completed, but we are now trying to put the readers, I'm trying to get together some funding to create a new website so that all the readers can be put on the website too, and then people can download them for absolutely free and use them in any way they like, as long as they acknowledge the authorship. Now, Ethiopia, as you know, is situated in the Horn of Africa, a high plateau, for centuries remote and inaccessible, and the great salt route from the Danakil Desert in the east crossed the highlands into the Sudan, across the Sahara, to end up in places like Timbuktu. And those great trade routes brought with them stories. I saw them in the 1960s. I saw the mules laden with salt crossing the high passes. There's a fantastic diversity in Ethiopia. 75 languages are spoken. There are settled Christian farmers in the north. There are Muslims in the south and east. There are traditional religions in the remoter areas. The written history of Ethiopia goes back to classical times. there are peoples who have lived so remotely that they've only been contacted by outsiders in the last 5 or 10 years. And all this has given rise to a fantastic oral literature. Once I'd arrived in a certain place, I'd be greeted by the local regional cultural officer, and he would have set up a place for me to read stories. And we would have to entertain the storytellers with a meal or with chat, a drug they like to chew. And there were camel traders, farmers, a cloth merchant, hunter-gatherers, a prison governor, a judge, a Coptic nun. Oh, wait a minute, I've got some pictures of them, a few of them anyway. Oh, she told me such an incredible story. It's about the hare and the tortoise. I thought, oh, yeah, I know this story. But actually, it's really quite obscene. And I'm not going to tell you what kind of race they had because it's Sunday morning and it's mixed company. But if you want to know, go to the website, look up tortoise and rabbit, and you'll see what I mean. This is in Gambella. That's me in the background. I was a bit younger then with my tape recorder. I would tape the story from the storyteller, and then this is Ato Ogota, and he would translate it for me. And then I would go away and I'd write the stories in simplified English as the readers. And here is a Coptic nun in the north of Ethiopia. She had the most sorry, press on. And here's Guragi. He was quite a cheeky fellow. Oh no, wait a minute. That's all the storytellers. Got thousands more. Haven't got time to show you. I realised that traditional storytelling is not for children. It's not for children. The children would be shooed away quite often. Children would want to come and listen, but they were told to go away because this was an adult thing. What have we done to storytelling? Why is it now only for children? It's such a shame. I mean, it's to do with education and literacy and television, which I have to admit I was watching last night. But what has happened in the process of making stories only for children is that we've infantilized them. We have taken away their strength. Look at the story of Noah. It's the most horrific story about the destruction of the entire human race that you could possibly imagine. Now it's about sweet little animals going into a darling little boat. At the end of every session, people would say to me, "And what is the meaning of the story?" And there would then be a discussion on philosophy, politics if they dared sometimes, moral guidance, and sometimes they'd ask me to tell a story, and I would tell a story, and they'd say, "And what is the meaning?" I think, oh God, Beauty and the Beast. Oh, I'd say it's about the transforming power of love. And what about Red Riding Hood? Well, on that occasion, I was sitting with a group of women in a remote village with lions, actually. This is where we had guns, because there was a man-eating lion around. It was quite dangerous. And they said, "What's the meaning of Red Riding Hood?" I thought, crumbs, PhDs have been written on this subject. I looked around and I said, "The meaning of Red Riding Hood," I said, "is that it's very dangerous for young girls to go walking out in the bush on their own." And they all said, "That is very true." A wonderful variety of stories in Ethiopia. I found so many echoes with the Bible. There were stories there was the wonderful creation story where God calls all the animals to him and says, "I'm going to give you your gifts come tomorrow." The man is just one of the animals. And he says, who comes first gets the best gift. But he loved the buffalo. So he said to the buffalo, "Come first and I'll give you the best gift." The dog overheard and he ran to the man and said, she ran to the man, "Go very early in the morning, before the morning star rises, and you'll get the best gift." So very early, the man went to God, but he put hair on his arms so that he was like a buffalo. And in the dark, God felt his arms, and he thought he was the buffalo. And he gave him the best gift, and the gift was the spear. And then the buffalo came, and God said, "Who are you?" "I'm the buffalo." "No, the buffalo's already come." "Oh," said God, "I can't take back the gift. All I have for you is horns." And from that day, man rules the animals because he has the spear. That is the exact same story as the blessing of Jacob in the Bible. It's exactly the same. Rachel is the dog, God is Isaac, Jacob is the man, Esau is the buffalo. This story, the people who told me this story had no contact with the Bible at all. I believe the story they told me was older than the Old Testament. A story about waters of a lake parting and the people going in through the waters of the lake, the water closes over them. Underneath the waters of the lake, which parted from the left to the right, they become elephants and monkeys. They live there to this day. Such interesting differences of stories, creation myths, origin myths of tribes, often in several cases to do with incest, exactly like the story of Lot sleeping with his daughters, cunning tricksters, animal fables, clever women, a whole subgenre, inheritance, magical characters, jinns, ogres, the porcupine man, my favourite, who wanders to this day in the forest, zombies, my God, they're so scary. People still believe in them. I put some of these stories into this little book. It's very small. And these are the stories from the Somali region. That was a hairy journey, I'm telling you, down to the Somali regions. But I put these stories because we have many Somali refugees in this country, and these are stories that haven't been written down before, although you will find, if you read it, that the ogress and the snake is the same story as Hansel and Gretel. And I became fascinated by the way in which stories, well, there you are, Hansel and Gretel was told to me in Jijiga. And I became fascinated by the way stories flow around the world. They flowed across the Great Salt Route. They flowed from the into or from the Bible, from Aesop. And I became so fascinated that I began to go back to the stories I'd always known. And one of them, ever since I was a little girl, I'd adored the stories from Shahnameh. The story of Sohrab and Rustam. When I was 10, I read it in an encyclopedia, and I wept. I wept. So I've done this version for children. And there you are again, you see. There's in the Shahnameh, there is a story about a princess who's in love, and her lover comes to see her, and she puts her head over the balcony, and her hair falls down, and she says, "Climb up my hair." Have you heard that one before? Rapunzel. So there you are. And this poem was written by the great Iranian poet, a world figure of literature from Iran, called Ferdowsi, who wrote it 1,000 years ago. His anniversary was last year. And these are some stories. And Shireen Adil, who spoke to you yesterday, I think, did these exquisite illustrations, drawing on her her knowledge of Persian art. Thank you very much.
Well, so much of what Liz has been talking about has been my experience. And I don't know when Liz started travelling, but I was travelling ever since I was a child, being born in India, and then those early sea voyages that we used to make between India and England. My mother was English, my father Indian, and so we were constantly going to and fro. And I think on board ship, even from a very early age, I remember being the storyteller and gathering lots of children around me and telling stories that would frighten ourselves to death if possible. But storytelling began to become really important when I began to write. And I found that these old stories, the traditional stories and the fairy stories, which I'd been brought up with and were deeply part of my imagination, began to reflect the structures that I was trying to write in. For example, in the Surya trilogy, which is my set of novels about Indian partition and this division between Britain and India, which was part of my upbringing, I found that I could use the Ramayana as a kind of framework in which to construct those novels, because it's all about search and quest and so on. So very early on, folktale and mythology I found really inspiring and a structure for me to write against. But it is this travelling, and as Liz was saying, this idea of stories moving about along the silk routes and the trade routes and the spice routes. She was discovering Hansel and Gretel. I was thinking of Cinderella, and the more I went into Cinderella, and there are so many versions, the oldest apparently being Chinese. Even reading King Lear and realizing that the opening of King Lear is actually Cinderella in many, many ways. And each culture finding their own take on that story, which is why when we sometimes rub up against cultural appropriation or misappropriation, it jars, because the whole thing about storytelling is the way that they travel and move around and get absorbed into all these different cultures, who are able to use the central human condition in which to re-express their own cultures. So it's incredibly important that stories do travel. And going all the way back to Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, these stories, again, about movement, and the old storytellers that Liz was able to show us on the screen of the Ethiopian storytellers, I had a strong feeling that there would have been some set pieces that the storyteller would invoke from an audience, that they would know terms like the wine Red Sea or grey-eyed Athena, and that maybe they would have chanted back some set pieces. I've always longed to try and reconstruct that, to see if it was possible to get an audience who all knew the stories. One felt these were stories so ancient and incredibly familiar that a storyteller could interact with an audience like that, as indeed they do in India with Indian music. If they choose a particular raga or a particular key, the audience knows it. They know when the musician is embellishing or doing something amazing, but he'll come back to the central key, and they know it. And I feel there's that deep knowledge in these ancient stories that we suddenly say, oh, that's Cinderella, that's Hansel and Gretel, that's Sleeping Beauty, even though it may be a Finnish story or Chinese or Indian. So that has been such a source of inspiration as I've been writing throughout the years. And when Francis Lincoln, when Janetta asked me to do stories in the Panchatantra, I was very keen not just to write another selection of stories from the Panchatantra, because there are so many. As with Aesop, I wanted to remember that many, many stories, including great ancient collections like the Arabian Nights, are what we call frame stories. I'm sure I don't have to tell you what frame stories are, but they're stories within stories within stories. And that is really what I wanted to do. And as a storyteller, I wanted to be able to create my own story in order to set the context in which to then tell a story from the Panchatantra. And that's what I found most challenging and most rewarding about writing School for Princes. And I called it School for Princes because I also wanted to remember the premise on which the Panchatantra was written, which was that there was a king with 3 very unruly princes who seemed to be uneducable. Now, we seem to be talking about a time when there was obviously some kind of literacy, because he says they throw down their books and tear out the pages. And, of course, we don't know at what point in history these descriptions are being made. And the original author of the Panchatantra is supposed to be a man called Vishnu Sama. But as with Valmiki and the Ramayana, you're not quite sure whether they really are the originators of the story or the original scribes, or whether they themselves are iconic storytellers who just get absorbed into the mythology. At any rate, the basis for the Panchatantra is that there was a king with his 3 sons who seemed to be uneducable, and he was in despair and saying, what am I going to do? How can I leave my kingdom to these hooligans? And then somebody said, Sire, we've heard of this old man, a holy man who is a scribe and who is a storyteller. Let me bring him into the court. And so this old man comes into the court, Vishnu Sama is his name, and the king says, I'll give you 10 years to educate my son. And the scribe says, I don't need 10 years, I just need 6 weeks. And the king is appalled and outraged and thinks he's being made fun of. But what Vishnu Sama says is, through storytelling, I can turn your sons around just like that. He says they've been fed, and this rings such a bell in our present-day education system. He says they've been fed on a diet of dry wood and fats. It doesn't mean anything to them. If I tell stories, they will understand what the world is about and what their role in the world is to be. And so we get this start of the great storytelling, and it's a complexity of frame writing, stories within stories. So I sort of set up all those characters and allow these tales to be interwoven. He chose 5 stories within his main frame: losing friends, winning friends, loss of gains, something called Owls and Crows, which really intrigued me very much, and rash deeds. Now, in any one of those stories, you'll find echoes of Aesop and many of the stories that Liz has talked about. So again, where do we start? How far back do we go? Where do they originate? Is it something to do with the human condition, whereby we all know certain things? It's built into our framework, whatever culture we come from. Or is it because of these traveling storytellers? And I suspect it's both, because human beings all know about rage, ambition, jealousy, acquisition, love, hatred. They're all basic themes within our own lives. There was another book. I'm going to try and click this. I'm not sure whether it'll come. There we are. Obviously, one of the great passions, being half Indian and half English, I had a very passionately cultured English mother with her English literature and history. And so I was really brought up in a European literary tradition. And my father kind of accepted that as well. I suppose being a Christian, he hadn't really explored his own cultural background either, the Hindu and Islamic stories that are to be found in India. And I felt it was I, who began to explore my Indian heritage and began to look at Indian mythology and was very excited again. I didn't expect to find parallels. But I did, as with the old fairy tales, discovering Cinderellas and Hansel and Gretels everywhere. I was finding, well, obviously the flood story, which we know is in so many cultures and which supports the idea that there was some major flood at some point. But when I was reading the story of what I came to call Manu's Ark, lo and behold, it was indeed a Noah's Ark story, but with a wonderful Indian take on it. And the other thing I began to find about Indian mythology, how it reflects the geography of India. When you're reading about the gods, the Lord of Heaven, Indra, the Lord of Heaven, and the gods up in the heavens, those heavens were the Himalayas. It even led me to wonder whether the word Himalayas, people say Himalayas. I was brought up to say Himalayas, but actually I'm coming back to Himmel, which in German means heaven. And the Aryans came out of Germany. Did they bring the word Himalaya? I don't know. It's so tantalizing and very exciting. When I was traveling in Uzbekistan and went to Tashkent, Kent means garden in Uzbekistan. Kent is the Garden of England. Where did the word come from? I've never been able to find out if there's any link, but it means garden. Those sort of things are so exciting. Then if you take the story of the Ramayana, it starts up in the north, Ayodhya. When Sita is kidnapped, she's taken south. So you can actually cover the whole of India from top to bottom and all the way down to Sri Lanka. And it's wonderful to tell that story with a map. But also when you're traveling in India, this is where Sita dropped her bracelet. This is where she threw out her ring. This is where Lakshman and Rama stopped. This is where he got his bow. I mean, the whole geography of India is encapsulated in that wonderful Ramayana, which was such a source of interest. Then another story which I felt had a parallel is the birth of Krishna. I'm not sure. I think now that Krishna is a good deal older than the birth of Christianity and Jesus. So what do we have in the birth of Krishna? We've got a king, we've got princesses. Devaki was a princess. She was going to give birth to a child who was going to threaten the power of caste. God decides to intervene. So in a very traditional Hindu way, Vishnu enters the womb of Devaki so that he can be born again as Krishna. And Krishna is therefore God himself. We've got Jesus being born as God. And then in order to rescue Krishna, his father has to steal him away in the night and cross the river. We've got the flight of Egypt. But in the story of Jesus, he is brought up by a carpenter, a modest carpenter and his wife. In Krishna, he escapes with his father, who delivers him over to a simple cowherd and a wife. So there's so many real parallels in those two stories, which I find fascinating. And Liz is right. This whole business of why stories and folk stories seem to have been brought down to simply tales for children is such a loss for the rest of us. And it does bring me back again to this business of the written word. It's, of course, been transforming. It has helped civilization. There's no question about it, that literacy has managed to solidify knowledge, make it available, make it able, in fact, particularly scientifically, to pass on to the next generation to enlarge and discover and research and so on. But I think there is a downside to literacy, which is this solidifying of story. This is a story, it belongs here, and this is what happened, and so it's that one version that can get passed on. Luckily, we have had storytellers, whether it was Perrault or Grimm or subsequent storytellers, who've taken their own versions and given their own take on it. And I think that is essential for these folk stories. I don't think they should be set in stone. They need to breathe and continue to travel and fall into the hands of other storytellers, because what they're doing in the end is reminding us of our common humanity. Try and break away all these wretched divisions that divide us and bring us to war and all the horrible things that are going on around us. All we have to do is go back to these stories to realize their unifying and wonderful messages that they give us as a common people. Thank you.
Yes, my two friends have certainly opened the way, and following on from what Liz and Jamila have said, I think what I'm going to be talking about is what has also been the effect of colonization on this whole process of storytelling, because this is the landscape of my dreams. This is where I, the city child from Joburg, would be taken by my parents. And it's very much an imaginative landscape for me. I should just say, actually, that the Marikana, the mines where that ugly massacre took place, at night, when the lights twinkle, that actually is Marikana down there. Beautiful landscape, ugly events, and ugly things happening between people. Well, I grew up in South Africa as that white colonial child with Aesop's fables and Brer Rabbit, as well as African folk tales, but they were inversions that were Europeanized and essentially westernized. Yet these were animals that I knew from my city zoo down the road, and that I occasionally encountered when I was taken out into what we called the bushveld. And those animals included the little dassie, the little African hare. And my parents were, yes, they were storytellers in their own, in their way. And my mother, for a very popular radio series, we weren't allowed television in those days. Television was seen as the great evil through which, ideas might come in that might subvert everybody. And so radio was highly popular. And my parents wrote a series called Tales from the Bushveld, with my dad my dad was a musician, making the songs. But what you can see from this is a record sleeve of a record that was produced of some of those tales, is actually they were full of Western and European references. So, for instance, two of the titles of these, they were funny, they were witty. One was King Lion's Treasure Island and Mr. Jackal's Fairy Tale. And they mostly actually focused on the rivalry between King Lion and Mr. Jackal. And it was only years later, many years later, after our son was born, that I came across, and this was newly brought out in the States, and then came to Britain. I think it was Bodley Head. Julius Leicester, the Newbery Honour winner, who'd written the seminal To Be a Slave, and he brought out this series of tales, The Knee-High Man, and other tales, with these very interesting illustrations by Ralph Pinto. And in the blurb, the publisher's blurb, there was a focus saying that there was a rich tradition of American black folk tales, originally told among slaves. And many of these were actually about the relationship between slaves and their slave owners. But, it wasn't even then that the penny dropped for me. It actually was 10 years later when I read the foreword, Julius Leicester's own foreword, to his retelling of the tales of Uncle Remus and the adventures of Brer Rabbit. And there, for the first time, I think the penny dropped for me, that actually Brer Rabbit was that little African Dussie. It was little Mootla, the hare. And he begins his foreword with a quote from the great Italian storyteller, Italo Calvino. And this is what the quote that he starts with. The tale is not beautiful if nothing is added. Folk tales remain merely dumb until you realize you are required to complete them yourself, to fill in your own particulars. And then Leicester, in his foreword, he kind of puts this in his own words, and he says, folk tales are not cultural artifacts. That I think very much links in to what both of you have been saying. In actuality, we are the tale, and folk tales are a mirror in which we can see, if we know how to see, our particular story. So very much a rephrasing, I think, of what, and fitting in and continuing this line of what Liz and Jamila have been talking about. And it was many years later that I began my own retellings. And I have to say that it took me a long time before I actually did The Great Tug of War, about this little hare who is using his wits to get the better of these bigger, bossier, more powerful animals. And the reason was I needed Julius Leicester to tell me that first. Why? Because I had grown up in a society in which people were dehumanized and animals were humanized. And so as I began, these are actually the tales that Laird and Tiro from Journey to Joburg would have been told by their grandmother, except in my telling. But for so long, I felt that, I had grown up with tale in which, the animals were humanized, but all the representations of Africans in the books that I had, were highly dehumanized. But I'm so glad to be released, finally, to be able to begin to have my own fun with the retellings. And Piet Grobler, did the wonderful illustrations, very quirky and in here. And Janetta at Francis Lincoln asked me if I would like him to do the illustrations when I came up with the idea of, hold on, I grew up with Aesop's fables as thinking that these are, he was an old, wise Greek man, and all the versions that I had as a child and that I'd ever seen were actually Europeanized versions, and the illustrations had kind of reinforced that. And but now I've begun to think, actually, hold on, I think, and I'll go into this a little bit later, there seems very, very good reason to believe that Aesop may very well have been African. And but I'd never questioned it as a child. And of course, as that child in southern Africa, the rest of Africa, between me and in Europe, was actually a vast blank space, with one or two exceptions. I mean, Kenya being one of them, because there was a kind of strong colonial connection with cousins up in Kenya. So that kind of reinforced it. The Ladybird book, until quite recently, until really the 1970s, even possibly 80, the Ladybird book of Africa showed Egypt kind of attached to Europe, not to Africa. And every Aesop fable, though, of course, had a moral. Well, that's how I'd come to associate them. Often a harsh lesson to be learnt. I gather that one theory is that actually these morals were possibly added on by the people who used Aesop's fables in Greece to make their own points. And so again, there are all kinds of questions about, what is the actual original? But nevertheless, there's such a strong tradition within Africa of proverbs and telling tales that are entertaining, but actually that, what is the meaning of this? What's the lesson? It's completely integrated. You'll be gripped by the tale, but actually, there's a purpose to it. And so who was Aesop? And Pete, the forward I did, the Dear Reader forward, Pete did this amazing version of Aesop, an Aesop captured and being taken off to Greece. And actually, under the letter, there's a picture of a little boat going, with a very blue Mediterranean sea. And nothing really, I think, could be said that we actually know for sure who was the real Aesop. But it was later when there were great Greek philosophers and writers who mentioned, who spoke about him. So that included Socrates, Aristophanes, Plato, Aristotle. But it's generally believed now that Aesop was born around BC 620 and died in the 6th century. One date is placed is 564 BC, which would actually place him before Buddha. But we know that ancient Greeks referred to black Africans as Ethiopians. And so we might conjecture that Aesop sounds pretty close to Ethiop. And there was, it seems, the idea of Aesop being ugly and seen as deformed. And that actually grew in popular imagination. And it seems to me that's very likely a reflection of the attitudes of slave owners to slaves. And there's this very interesting porcelain Aesop that's in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, UK. And from the 18th century, you can see him here in 18th century dress. But by this time, or soon after, the idea of an African, so we've got the idea of an African Aesop right here in Britain, in the 18th century. But that then becomes submerged. And again, the question I would ask, does it become submerged because a slave-owning society cannot cope with the idea of actually a wise slave who commented on that society? And of course, as you both said, these were for adults. You know, children might sneak in because these are good tales, but these were for adults. This was commentary on adults. And so we've got this whole thing of Aesop's fables being recast as stories for children. And it raises very interesting parallel with the folk tales originally told by African slaves in America to adults, you know, with, again, the children sneaking in. But it's only when these tales are recorded by Joel Chandler Harris, and I have to say that Julius Lester, pays him good tribute to Joel Chandler Harris. He's much more generous, I would say, than Virginia Hamilton in his assessment of Joel Chandler Harris. And it's, but of course, you know, Joel Chandler Harris had those Brer Rabbit tales being told by an old, faithful old slave. You could say the Uncle Tom character being told to children. And they get into print and they become hugely popular. They've now been, you know, turned into something for children. And someone like Julius Lester is reclaiming them and you know, incredibly energizing them again for that society. And yet, just as, you know, as both, I mean, we haven't conferred on this together, but we're both ending, we're all three are ending in the same way, because what I wanted to say at the end of, you know, Aesop's fables remain pertinent comment, you know, after 2,500 years on human behavior. You know, it's envy, it's greed, it's deceit, it's gullibility, it's arrogance, it's laziness, and, you know, and occasionally, I would have to say with Aesop, it's occasionally, you know, we get, you know, those those qualities of compassion and decency and kindness and loyalty and perseverance. And Aesop understood that about power and the desire to manipulate and how easily one could be manipulated. And I want to end with this story, The Lion and the Warthog. And Pete and I have put it into a South African setting. Well, it was one blistering hot day, and both Warthog and Lion had the same idea: get down to the waterhole and drink. And they arrived at the waterhole at the very same time. "I go first," growled Lion. "Hi, Connor." "No, you don't," retorted Warthog. And before you knew it, they were grappling. Claws, tusks, claws, tusks, claws, tusks. Fighting, tearing at each other. They were tearing each other to death. Until suddenly each needed to take a breath, and panting, they looked up, and there above the waterhole, in a tall tree, was a line of vultures. "It's better to be friends," said Lion. Yebo, said Warthog. And, of course, Aesop's moral was, it's safer to be friends than enemies.
Well, I think that was completely fascinating. I'm sure you'll agree it was fantastic to hear about all those links between the stories and to unpick the threads. We're almost out of time. I've been thinking about cultural identity of the storyteller while they've been talking and while I was thinking about this, and I just have one question that actually I might ask Liz to answer. I mean, it's interesting that Beverley is telling the Aesop, but setting it in Africa. Jamila has been exploring her Indian roots. Liz is actually telling stories from other cultures, from her travels. Does it matter whether the storyteller is from the culture? I mean, as a publisher, we're sometimes asked when publishing collections of folktales to find an illustrator from the culture. For instance, we're trying to do Afghan folktales, and we've been told we must try to find an Afghan illustrator. And I wonder, how much do you think this matters, Liz?
I think it would be excellent if I was Ethiopian, Iranian, Iraqi. I would love to be all of them. Actually, I'm a Scot, really, born in New Zealand and live in London. Sorry about that. It is a cosmopolitan city. I wrestle with this all the time. It worries me a great deal, and I think about it a lot. And I know that it's easy to do the wrong thing. As far as the Ethiopian stories are concerned, I was working very closely with the Ministry of Education in Ethiopia and the regional cultural bureaus. And I had spent years in Ethiopia as a young woman in the 1960s teaching English at the university. And a lot of people said to me, and this is something quite hard to swallow, if you hadn't come, a foreigner, a Ferengi, as they call me, if you hadn't come, we wouldn't have thought the stories were important. And there was a way in which, because I had come all the way from Britain and I travelled sometimes 2-3 days in a Land Rover to arrive in these places, that it gave the stories to them a worth and a dignity. And it stimulated the regional cultural bureaus to carry on and collect more stories themselves. So I think in that sense I was a catalyst. As far as the other story is concerned, I refute the claim that nobody can tell stories except for the people. Thank you, Jo. Thank you both. Because the stories that we've been writing and talking about are world stories. They belong to everybody. The stories from this story from Somalia about In the Ogress and the Snake, it's actually the same story as Hansel and Gretel. It really is. I mean, it's about children who are lost and so on in the bush. But there is no possession. People don't own folk stories. They belong to the world. There is no copyright in folk stories. They belong to the whole world. And I think everybody has a right to tell them, to use them, to enjoy them in every way, as long as we very carefully acknowledge.
Jamila, did you want to?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't think there's going to be a huge argument, I hope, about the telling of folk stories. But I think the notion of cultural appropriation is when you go into the novel, into fiction, and that you choose to write about, in fictional terms, you choose to write, say, a novel about someone else's culture. This is where there has been a lot of criticism. I absolutely, I uphold my right to write about anything I want to write. You don't have to read it. If you don't like it, you can say, I don't trust this person to write about this culture. I won't bother reading it. But I absolutely uphold my right as a writer to want to enter someone else's mind, someone else's culture and background in whatever way I choose. And as in Liz's case, it might actually be helpful because not all societies have such a powerful literary heritage as perhaps we do in the West. So many cultures are still very much storytelling cultures. When I was in Canada, I wanted to write about the Inuit culture. I'd been to an exhibition and seen some wonderful sculptures. That was actually their expression, along with their own verbal storytelling. And I'd love to have written some stories, which I would have called stories from the hood, because the hood of the Inuit was so powerful. But no, I got the wagging finger. You can't do that. That's cultural misappropriation. But I raged against it, and I don't know if Beverley's got anything
Well,
to say
I
about
have faced this, and I faced it quite early on in a way that I found very, very useful for me, because I then had to sort it out in my mind. And I'll just tell you briefly how it happened. I was in a London school shortly after Journey to Joburg had been published, and I was on kind of a panel, and there was a young black ANC comrade next to me, and a young woman got up in the audience and she said, "What right have you to tell this story about these two black, South African children? What do you know about it?" And before I could answer, Andile Maseko jumped up and he said, "Look, hold on. You know, this is what we're actually struggling for in South Africa. I mean, we're talking now early 80s, well, mid-80s we're going back to. And he said, you know, we want to be able to have a study where we're not constantly in, you know, separating the boxes. But I went home and I thought very much closely about it. And what I've now, and what it brought me to is the realization that actually one has to separate out two areas. And one area is who is writing. And it's absolutely true that far more needs to be done. And I have to say, Francis Lincoln is one of the publishers we absolutely have to honor for trying to open up the doorways to, you know, diversity. They run a kind of a diversity voice, the voices, your whole program there, and have been splendid in that. But actually, if we look at the publishing scene, it's absolutely true. This publishing scene is still, you know, it's dominantly white, and you know, and I think that's across the board. So, or it's about vampires, so we've got other things as well.
Well,
but
let's leave the vampire.
Yeah, but just to say that, so
2
what
minutes.
I said is the writer must be free to write what they write, and you must judge the work on how the work is. You know, someone can say, okay, I don't like the way you got that, you know, and that is not credible. Credibility, you know, I do huge research for a credibility check, but...
For research,
Oh,
Beverley.
absolutely.
I mean, when I wrote The
Completely
Garbage
so.
King, I spent a long time with street children in Addis Ababa who told me their stories. And, you know...
Well, we do it. So we
Yes.
do the huge research, and
Yeah.
we will be judged on whether we've done that well or not. But actually, there's another thing as activists to keep the campaigning going, to try and open the doors.
Yes,
and where are
absolutely.
the diversity of illustrators and young writers who are actually in colleges coming through? And that links into the bigger political question of the
Ladies,
society.
I've
So I won't
opened
go
a
there.
huge discussion, probably bigger than I intended to.
But I would please, Janetta, like to say one thing, and that is, we writers can give ourselves the rights to write what we want to write. But it's publishers who've got to open the doors to the writers that other people say aren't getting their
Yeah.
chances.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank
Can
you
I just
very
say,
much.
I just want to say one more thing, and this is a bit of shameless self-promotion, because I've just written a book about my travels in Ethiopia, which is going to be published next year, and I don't know what it's going to be called. But please do look out for it, because nobody's going to buy it. Sorry. It's a grown-ups book.
Thank you to all three of these wonderful authors.